You have lived through a part of your life that you can never visit again. Not in the usual way, not like remembering a classroom or a holiday or the face of someone you used to know. I mean a whole stretch of existence. A massive, foundational section of your life that happened to you, shaped you, changed you, and then disappeared behind a wall so complete it almost feels artificial. You do not remember being carried before you could walk. You do not remember what the world felt like before language. You do not remember discovering that a voice could comfort you, or that a face could mean safety, or that leaving and returning were two different things. And yet all of that happened. You were there for it. You experienced the first years of your life from the inside, and now, for the most part, they are gone. That is a very strange thing when you stop and actually sit with it. Because forgetting your keys is ordinary, forgetting a name is ordinary, forgetting a conversation from 3 Tuesdays ago is ordinary. But forgetting the first chapter of your existence, forgetting the years in which your brain learned more, changed faster, and absorbed more reality per day than it ever would again, that is not ordinary forgetting. That is something closer to a built-in vanishing act. And the unsettling part is not just that your baby memories are missing. It is that the missing years were probably the most important years of all. So what happened to them? Why did they fade away? Were they never stored in the first place? Were they erased? Were they buried somewhere unreachable? Or is the real answer stranger than all of those? It turns out modern research gives us a much better answer than people had for most of history, and the answer is fascinating because it forces you to rethink what memory even is. The first mistake most people make is imagining memory as a recording, as if your brain has a camera inside it. Something happens, the camera captures it, and later you hit play. That is not what memory is. Memory is not footage. Memory is construction. Whenever you live through an event, your brain does not store a neat little video file. It breaks the experience into pieces. Sensation, emotion, sequence, meaning, context, relevance. Different systems process different parts. What the room looked like, how your body felt, whether the moment was threatening or safe, whether it is connected to something important, whether it deserves to be kept. Then, if things go well, those pieces are linked together into a retrievable experience. Not just something happened, but this happened to me. That distinction matters. Because a real autobiographical memory is not just stored information. It is a personal event organized around a self. It has to be bound into a narrative your mind can later re-enter. And that depends heavily on brain systems that, in early life, are still under construction. That brings us to the first major reason your baby memories faded. The brain structure most closely associated with forming declarative, consciously retrievable memories is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is not the whole memory system, but it is central to turning experience into something you can later deliberately recall. And in infancy, that system is not mature, not absent, not useless, but not mature. That difference is important. Because babies are not empty, they are not passive, they are not unconscious spectators floating through meaningless sensations. Research shows infants can learn and remember. Even pre-verbal infants can retain information, and by the end of the first year, memory for specific events is already measurably present. But the kind of memory that becomes stable, narrative, autobiographical recollection develops much more slowly in step with the ongoing maturation of hippocampal and cortical systems. So the first answer is not that nothing was experienced. It is that the system required to package experience into durable autobiographical memory was still becoming functionally competent. A baby can feel fear, relief, curiosity, delight. A baby can learn patterns. A baby can remember in ways that shape future behavior. But that is not the same thing as creating the kind of memory a 30-year-old mind can intentionally revisit and describe. Your early brain was doing real work. It just was not filing those experiences in the format your later self would be able to browse. And if that were the whole answer, it would already be interesting. But it is not the whole answer. Because even after the hippocampus becomes more capable, Something else is happening in early life that makes stable long-term memory unusually difficult. This is where the story gets stranger. Your infant brain is not just smaller than an adult brain. It is far more active in one very specific and destabilizing way. It is building itself at extraordinary speed. For a long time, people assumed the brain came into the world with its full supply of neurons, and after that it was mostly a matter of preserving what was already there. That view turned out to be wrong. New neurons continue to appear in important regions, especially in the hippocampus. And in early life, that process is happening at an especially intense rate. This matters because memory depends on networks. When new neurons are added into those networks at high speed, the system becomes better at adaptation and learning, but worse at preserving older traces in stable form. In simple terms, the early brain is optimized for plasticity, and plasticity is not the same thing as permanence. The very thing that makes babies incredible learners may also be one of the reasons they are poor long-term archivists. Some researchers describe infantile amnesia partly through this lens. High postnatal hippocampal neurogenesis may destabilize existing memory circuits as new neurons integrate into them. The network keeps rewiring itself while learning is exploding. That is a brilliant design for rapid adaptation. It is a terrible design for preserving old episodes exactly as they were. Think of it like trying to organize a library while the building is still under construction. Every day, new shelves are being added, entire sections are being moved. The cataloging system keeps changing. Some books are placed somewhere temporarily, then shifted, then surrounded by new material, then reorganized again. The library is getting more powerful by the week, but if you ask where one specific early book went, the answer becomes harder and harder to give. That may be what your early hippocampus was like. An unbelievably productive system, but an unstable one. You were not failing to learn. You were learning too aggressively to preserve everything in a later accessible form. And that changes the emotional meaning of the question. Because instead of saying, "Why was I so bad at remembering?" the deeper answer may be, because your brain has a more urgent job than remembering. It had to become a brain. It had to learn how faces work, how voices work, how objects persist, how patterns repeat, how emotion predicts behavior, how to distinguish safety from danger, how to find regularity in chaos, how to extract a world from raw sensation. And if the cost of doing that at astonishing speed was that your first years would not remain consciously retrievable, evolution may have considered that a trade worth making, but even that is still not the whole answer. Because memory is not just biology, it is also a language. And this is the part many people underestimate. Most of the memories you think of as your life are not just stored events. They are narrated events. They are experiences you can internally structure. This happened, then that happened, then I felt this, then this changed, then I understood something. That kind of memory depends on more than sensation and emotion. It depends on a framework. It depends on the ability to organize experience into a story. And the story depends heavily on language, not just language for speaking to other people. Language for building a self across time. A baby may have a present tense self, a center of feeling, a here-ness, an experiencing point of view. But autobiographical memory requires something more elaborate than present tense consciousness. It requires an I that can travel backward, an I that can say, "That was me then, and this is me now." That kind of continuity is supported by language in profound ways. Language does not merely express autobiographical memory after the fact. It helps organize it in the first place. It provides order, emphasis, sequence, evaluation, meaning. It turns scattered impressions into a coherent mental event. It gives experience a shape you can return to. Without that scaffold, early experiences may still matter enormously, but they are less likely to become the kind of memories you can later narrate to yourself. No story, no stable narrator, no easily retrievable personal past. This also helps explain why the age of earliest memory is not identical for everyone. Children do not develop autobiographical memory in isolation. They develop it socially. In part, they learn how to remember from other people. When parents talk to children about past events in detailed, emotionally rich, elaborative ways, children tend to form earlier, stronger autobiographical memories. They learn that experiences can be revisited, described, organized, and made meaningful. In that sense, memory is not only neural, it is cultural, it is conversational. That idea is more profound than it first sounds, because it means remembering is not just something your brain does alone in the dark. It is also something you are taught. A child hears, "Remember when we went there?" Remember what happened next? Remember how you felt? And slowly, almost invisibly, a skill is being built. Not the skill of having experiences, the skill of turning experiences into a retrievable personal history. Which means your earliest memories depend partly on the kind of developmental conversation that surrounded you, how people spoke to you, how often the past was revisited, whether your experiences were treated as worth preserving. Even culture matters here. Researchers have found differences in earliest autobiographical memory across cultural groups, and those differences appear tied in part to how selves are constructed and how families engage in reminiscing. Some groups emphasize individual recollection and personal detail more than others. Some encourage richer memory talk, some do not. So now the picture gets clearer. Your baby memories faded because the systems that support durable autobiographical memory were still developing. They faded because the hippocampal network was undergoing intense growth and reorganization. They faded because language had not yet fully become the scaffolding of the self across time, and together those three forces create something like a perfect storm. You were learning intensely, you were experiencing reality, you were being shaped every day. But the format in which those experiences were processed was not the same format in which your later mind stores a life story. That would already explain a lot. But there is one more layer that makes this even stranger. The years you cannot remember still live inside you, not as scenes, not as narrated episodes, but as patterns. This is one of the hardest things to really absorb. People often assume that if something cannot be consciously remembered, then it is gone. But memory is not one thing. There is explicit memory, the kind you can deliberately recall, and there are implicit forms of memory. Expectations, emotional responses, bodily learning, relational assumptions, habits of reaction, ways of anticipating the world that do not arrive as stories. So when people say they remember nothing from infancy, that is only true in one sense. They may remember nothing explicitly, but infancy may still be present in how they attach, calm down, orient toward people, react to unpredictability, or interpret comfort. The experience is no longer accessible as a movie, but it may survive as a calibration, as settings, as a baseline for how the world seems. That is why the disappearance of baby memories is not evidence that those years did not matter. It is almost the opposite. Those years may matter so much that they became infrastructure, too deep to replay, too foundational to appear as scenes. You do not remember installing the operating system on a device. But everything the device does afterward depends on it. That may be closer to what the first years of life are like. Not a folder you can open, a structure you are running on. And once you understand that, a haunting possibility appears. What if some of the feelings you call just how I am began in a period you can never consciously inspect? What if part of your confidence, your anxiety, your sense of safety, your readiness to trust, your sensitivity to distance, your emotional reflexes, all carry traces of experiences you cannot narrate because they were encoded before autobiographical memory was fully online? That does not mean every adult trait can be traced neatly to infancy. Human beings are much more complicated than that, but it does mean your forgotten years may be acting on you more than you realize. And there is another twist. Some of the earliest memories you think you do have may not be fully yours. This is where memory becomes deeply unnerving, because once you accept that memory is reconstructive, not reproductive, You also have to accept that the first scenes of your life may have been assembled later from fragments, stories, photographs, and repetition. Maybe you have an early memory of a birthday, maybe a crib, maybe a kitchen, maybe a family trip. But where did that memory come from? Did it come from direct experience preserved over time? Or did it come from hearing the story so often that your brain eventually built a memory-shaped model of it? Research on false autobiographical memories shows how suggestion, repeated storytelling, and even photographs can help people form vivid recollections of events that were distorted or never directly remembered in the way they now feel remembered. That does not mean all early memories are fake. It means confidence is not proof. Familiarity is not proof. Vividness is not proof. Systematic review on false autobiographical events. PubMed, that is psychologically disorienting, because it suggests that your earliest sense of your own past may be partly inherited. Not genetically inherited, narratively inherited. A family tells you who you were. A photo gives the story a surface. The story gets repeated enough times that it stops feeling borrowed. And one day it feels like a memory. You may not actually remember the event. You may remember the reconstruction. And yet, subjectively, the difference can be almost impossible to detect. So now the mystery deepens. Not only are your first years mostly inaccessible, even the edge of that darkness may be populated by reconstructions wearing the mask of memory. That sounds bleak at first, but it leads to an important realization. The self is not built only from what it can explicitly recall. It is built from what it has absorbed, from what it has been told, from what it has practiced, from what has shaped its nervous system, its expectations, its language, its emotional habits. In other words, the self is built from much more than memory. And that may be why infantile amnesia feels so philosophically strange, because it reveals that the most formative part of your life may lie outside the spotlight of conscious narrative. The person who became you was assembled partly in darkness, not mystical darkness, developmental darkness, before your memory could tell a story about itself, before your mind could tag moments as chapters in a biography, before there was a stable narrator to say, "This is mine, keep this." So why do some people remember earlier than others? Partly because development varies. Partly because language varies. Partly because families vary in how they talk about the past. Partly because culture changes what kinds of memories get rehearsed and valued. Some studies also find gender differences, with women on average often reporting earlier or more detailed autobiographical memories, though the causes are likely a mix of biology, socialization, and conversational style, rather than any single simple factor. Nelson Fivish Theory PDF. There is no single magic age where memory suddenly switches on. It is more like a long transition. A fog is thinning. The average person's earliest reliable autobiographical memories tend to cluster somewhere around the preschool years, but the border is messy. Before that, there may be fragments, islands, emotional residues, flashes, but not the dense continuous personal recall most adults think of as memory. PMC Review. And that brings us to the part of the answer that matters most right now. What should you do with the fact that your first years are gone? Maybe the first thing is to stop thinking of them as wasted. They were not wasted because you cannot replay them. They were not empty because you cannot quote them. Those years were doing something more basic than making stories. They were building the conditions under which stories would later become possible. They were laying down the architecture, the sensory rules, the relational expectations, the learning systems, the first assumptions about how reality behaves. The deeper grammar of being alive. You do not remember learning that faces carry emotion, but you read faces constantly. You do not remember learning that objects continue to exist when they leave your sight. But you rely on that truth every day without effort. You do not remember how your earliest patterns of comfort and stress took shape. But your body may still know more about them than your words do. So the first years of your life did not vanish in the sense of becoming meaningless. They vanished in the sense of becoming invisible. There is a difference. Invisible is not unimportant. Invisible is often where the most important things are. That can feel disturbing, because it means some of what drives you began before you had access to language and before you could consciously organize experience. But it can also be strangely liberating, because if those early years shaped you without your permission, later years can reshape you without needing perfect access to the original source. You do not need a full replay of infancy to change a pattern that began there. You do not need to recover every missing scene to update an old expectation. Human beings remain plastic. Not as plastic as infants, maybe, but plastic enough. New relationships can teach safety. New routines can teach stability. New evidence can challenge ancient assumptions. Reflection can slow automatic reactions. Therapy can help name patterns that once lived only as feelings. Care can rewrite what chaos taught. The forgotten beginning is powerful. It is not destiny. And maybe that is the healthiest way to understand all of this. Your baby memories faded away not because your early life did not matter, but because it mattered in a different format. Those years were not designed mainly to be remembered. They were designed to build, to wire, to tune, to prepare, to turn a helpless organism into a mind that could eventually say, me. And by the time that me became stable enough to tell its own story, the scaffolding that built it had already done much of its work and stepped out of sight. So no, you do not remember the first great transformation of your life. You do not remember becoming yourself. You only live as its result, and that may be the strangest part of all. The oldest version of you is still here, not as a voice, not as a scene, not as a memory you can summon on command, but as a silent influence beneath nearly everything. The first years did not disappear, they sank deeper. They became structure, they became instinct, they became background code, they became the invisible draft of the person who would later sit somewhere, much older, asking where all those memories went. And the answer is, they did not all go nowhere. Some were never built to last as stories. Some were overwritten by a brain growing too fast to preserve them. Some were never given language, and without language they never hardened into autobiography. And some may still survive, not as recollection, but as the shape of you. So if it ever unnerves you that your life begins in silence, remember this. Silence is not the same thing as absence. A foundation does not need to be visible to hold a house up. And the most formative years of your life may be the ones you can never narrate, only live out. You lost the memories. You kept what they made.